delegation from the British House of Commons Procedures Committee, led by the Chair of that committee, Ms Cat Smith MP. And the delegation has a very busy itinerary of appointments today, and I trust the information we provide will be of some assistance in their work. You're all very welcome. Thank you. And now, under Standing Order 38, we move to Leaders' Questions. I call on Deputy MaryLouMcDonald, Leader of Sinn Féin.
Taoiseach, renting has never been more expensive or less secure than under your government. This week, daft.ie published their figures for the rental market for the start of this year. And rents are now climbing faster than at any point in the last 20 years. Average new rents are now over €2,000 a month. That's an eye-watering €24,000 a year on rent. And in Dublin City, new rents average now at €2,500 a month. That comes to a €30,000 yearly rent bill. Taoiseach, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, how can working people afford these rents? How on earth could anyone save for a home while paying such extortionate rent? People are getting ripped off and they are sick of it. It's no surprise that young people are going to Canada and Australia. What chance really do they have to make their life here? It's never been harder to rent a home, to buy a home, or to get a council home. We are in the middle of a housing emergency, a crisis that requires emergency measures, but there is absolutely no sense of urgency from you. I've never seen a government move so slowly or achieve so very little. In 6 months, your most significant legislation was to increase the wages for the biggest ministerial team ever seen. We've seen week after week of statements, committees limping into place, a real do-nothing government. And of course, you blame everyone else for your failures. It's the opposition's fault. It's the local council's fault. And now your housing minister is blaming the one modest protection that renters have, the rent pressure zones. In an interview with the Irish Examiner, Minister for Housing James Brown says that rent caps were, and I quote, significantly inhibiting the delivery of apartments in Dublin. Now, just to decode that, what he actually means is that vulture funds are telling him that in order to invest, they want to charge even higher rents. The minister says there has to be change. There's no question about that, he says. What does he mean, Taoiseach? That the rent pressure zone cap is to be raised? That landlords can reset the rent between tenancies to new market rents? That new rental properties will be completely exempt from control? Taoiseach, renters need to know what your minister means, because any of these measures will mean even higher rip-off rents for tenants. Tá an cías a méadú níos tapóla a nisnog ámarbe le 20 bliain anús. I lár géir céim costas marach tála ina bhfuil an Freister cuile rud a dul in orge, conna starlat atá ibrithe nanamis a bheith in ann €2,000 a íoc mar cías in aig na míosa. Tá is ag daoine go bhfuil drochmharga a dhéanamh leo agus tá siad bréanda. In the same interview, Minister Brown promised to protect renters. Now, Taoiseach, that's gaslighting renters, speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He tells landlords that they can jack up rents, and at the same time, he promises tenants protection. Of course, that's not possible. He can't do both of those things at the same time. So can you and your government come clean? Are you caving into the demands of vulture funds for even higher rents? Or are you going to give renters a break and stop these rip-off rent increases once and for all?
Thank you, Deputy.
Well, first of all, Deputy, the RTB rent index is the most reliable, I think, indicator in terms of rent prices and so on. It was published on the 15th of May, and according to the RTB, the standardised average rent for new tenancies nationally rose by 5.5% year on year to 1,680 in Q4 2024, while the rents for existing tenancies rose by 4.6% year on year to 1,440. These are high rents, under no illusions about that, even if those figures represented a decline in both rent levels from the previous quarter, Q3 of 2024, and continues the downward trend in the growth rate of rental levels observed since early 2023. But of course, the rents are too high. And the fundamental issue is supply. And you talk about never have you ever seen a government. I've never seen an opposition so bereft of ideas and so lacking in conviction on the housing issue. And the people, that's the bottom line. Because if you look at it overall and take the context, look at across the European Union, and many Western economies are having this dilemma in terms of the mismatch of housing demand and supply. From a European Union context, for example, Ireland is doing probably higher than most in increasing housing supply. In terms of real investment in dwellings, the Irish economy registered the fourth largest increase across the 27 EU countries. If you look at the recent ESRI publication comparing housing supply across Ireland, Northern Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales, it found that on a per capita basis, Ireland and Northern Ireland had the highest rate of house building, and Ireland and Scotland had the highest rate of public built housing. And that's against the backdrop of very significant population increase, persistent strong economic growth and income growth, and huge pressures on housing. So the government is spending very significant amounts of public capital money on housing. We need more private sector investment, Deputy. Now, the Housing Commission, which you supported, called for a review of the rent pressure zones. And the rent pressure zones are effective in terms of protecting renters and rent increases, but all of the established literature, and again the most recently quarterly bulletin from the ESRI is saying that long term we are restricting the growth of supply in the private market. I reckon state investment by the end of 2025 will certainly go close to 9 billion. Or 8 we're at 8 billion now at the moment in terms of state expenditure on housing. The Department of Finance is saying we need about 20 billion to get to the targets of what we need and that everybody in the House has agreed on. You are so lacking in any initiative in terms of how we bring private sector investment in. And it's a serious issue. You can smile all you like, but it's a serious. We need to be real with people here. And not coming in, because it seems to me what you really want is us to stay static in policy terms so that you end up not actually making the step change that is required on housing. So parallel with sustained investment from the public purse, from the exchequer, we will need significant increase in private sector investment. We need to create, and in line with the Housing Commission, we'll see what the review brings forward, but we most certainly need to create a secure investment landscape for investment in housing into the future on the private side to supplement the record levels of public sector investment in housing that we currently have in this country. And the first quarter of this year alone in terms of housing supply is the highest since 2004, or 2008, bar the COVID bounce in 2020 that came out.
Deputy MacDonald.
So what I want, Taoiseach, in summary, is I want you to stop screwing it up. That's actually what I want. I want you to take account of the fact and really accept the fact that you are presiding over an emergency and a catastrophe. Record levels of homelessness. This society is now so numbed to your failure that record numbers, 4,000 children, 5,000 children in homeless accommodation now, doesn't cause really a ripple in the public conversation. You have normalised your catastrophic failure. An entire generation is locked out of any prospect of home ownership and they can't afford the rent. And they're voting with their feet, Taoiseach. They are in Perth, they are in Toronto, they are not in Dublin and Cork and Galway and Limerick where we need them, their skill, their energy and their vitality. I asked you to explain to me comments from your housing minister.
Thank you.
So, and I want you to answer straight. What did he mean in respect of the one modest protection that you've afforded to renters in the rent pressure zone? What are his intentions? Are you siding again with the vulture funds, or are you going to side finally with tenants?
To respond.
There's a number of points. Dús par in team lat Neil and Cartagut, August Neil Moran, Retuk Gutsa, Model 5 Tehiochta. It's Toshin Soler. Deputy, you haven't addressed the core point I made. We need private sector investment. You used the phrase vulture funds. I believe, you're back to the heckling now because you don't like the answers. I believe passionately, in public sector investment. And we had, in 48,000 social houses alone in the last 4 years, we've had the highest level of social housing provided by any government in over 20 or 30 years. That's a fact, okay? And in the last, we exceeded our targets on housing for all in terms of 30,000+ houses over the last 3 to 4 years. That's a fact, but it's not enough. But we need private sector investment. You call it vulture fund. We do need institutional funding in the country to supplement the state level investment. And you shouldn't be, and that's the problem. In the last election, you had proposals that would screw first-time buyers. That's why the people. That's why the people didn't give you. That's why the people didn't give you any ringing endorsement of your housing problems. They failed to convince people the last time.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Ivana Bacik of the Labour Party.
Taoiseach, the United Nations has warned this week that 14,000 babies will die in Gaza if humanitarian aid is not allowed to enter. 14,000 babies. Last night, more child casualties, including a week-old baby. Taoiseach, there are no words to describe the horror that Israel is inflicting upon the people of Gaza. The wickedness of using starvation as a weapon of war against children cannot be overstated. It's a weapon of genocide. Human suffering at this scale, Taoiseach, requires us to do all we can in our power to stop it. Taoiseach, ours is a small country, but we have fierce diplomatic power. We know that Ireland and Spain led calls for review of the EU-Israel trade deal, and that's welcome. It's welcome, too, to see growing opposition to the deal among other member states. And that was a change that we led on. But, Taoiseach, we have a moral obligation to do more. Countries around the world, including, and our British visitors may hear this too, countries around the world have an obligation to do more. You have a moral obligation. The world is failing to stand with Gaza. So Ireland must stand with Palestinian children and civilians. We must stand up for humanity, because the response of the world would be very different if the headlines read that 14,000 babies in Ireland or Britain or any EU country would starve to death by the weekend. Every step would be taken to stop the preventable deaths of infants. Their suffering would not be treated with indifference. Yet in Gaza, it seems the world is going to stand by while 14,000 infants perish. And history will not forgive us for it, Taoiseach. Antonio Guterres has said the floodgates of horror have reopened. Gaza is a killing field. Civilians are in an endless death loop. Netanyahu's campaign was always driven by a plan to displace and to exterminate. Josep Borrell has said, "Seldom have I heard the leader of a state so clearly outline a plan that fits the legal definition of a genocide." And more people, even within Israel, are recognising this. I heard from an Israeli citizen this week who said, "As a human being, I hate this government with all my heart. They are willing to sacrifice innocent lives, Palestinians and our own hostages. This madness has to end." Taoiseach, President Michael D. Higgins is right. The UN Security Council has failed in carrying out its primary responsibility to maintain international peace. And at what cost of failure? More than 55,000 people, including 15,000 children, have been killed in Gaza since 7th October 2023. Nearly 300,000 more children on the brink of death and thousands injured. This is devastation, and the UN is failing in all of our names. So, Taoiseach, we must do more. Next week, we in Labour will bring a motion to the Dáil to mandate you to table an emergency resolution at the UN General Assembly to note the failure of the Security Council and to call for collective measures to secure a lasting ceasefire, a sustainable peace agreement and an international peacekeeping force for Gaza to allow humanitarian aid to flow and to save lives. Our colleague Deputy Duncan Smith and I will be looking for unanimous support across this House for our proposals. So, Taoiseach, will you pass the Occupied Territories Bill at home and abroad? Will you work to table that emergency motion at the UN?
Taoiseach, please, to respond.
Well, dúspáir é an tíim leis an theachta go thomráin agus is uafása an scéile ar fad an méid atá ag tarlú in Gaza agus an cogadh uafásach agus na mílte daoine agus lenaí go háir ag fáil bháis diascan na polisathe atá ag riamh Israel. Could I first of all say that I agree with your presentation of what is an absolutely barbaric and appalling situation within Gaza. There is absolutely no justification in any shape or form for what is occurring, and the persecution of this war is causing immense death, destruction and suffering to an entire population. I said recently it is simply wrong in principle and in law to inflict hunger and suffering on a civilian population, whatever the circumstances. And this behaviour clearly constitutes a war crime. It's also wholly unacceptable to contemplate the mass displacement of people in Gaza or to talk of permanent occupation. And not only is it an affront to decency and to international law, history tells us it offers no solution. I strongly welcome the decision to review the European Union-Israel Association Agreement together with Spain. As you say, Ireland first called for this. I actually believe the agreement should now be suspended pending the review. And I was, yesterday evening, I saw comments from the Minister for Finance in Israel, Finance Minister Smotrich, speaking openly about conquering Gaza and with God's help pushing the population south and into third countries. So this is a senior minister of the Israeli government articulating in no uncertain terms what the agenda is. And it is absolutely reprehensible. I think we need to say consistently also that the hostages need to be released. It is also absolutely unacceptable that innocent people were abducted and remain hostages so long after October the 7th. And that was an appalling, barbaric crime as well by Hamas. And Hamas need to, in my view, stop the war, disband, because they've caused nothing but misery to their own people. The Israeli government needs to stop what is happening right now. We need a ceasefire. We need a restoration of discussions towards a political pathway. But fundamentally, we need a massive surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza. It is incomprehensible what is happening. It's beyond any moral compass. I also have consistently called for an international delegation, be it political and journalists or media, to be allowed into Gaza, to see the enormity of the destruction that undoubtedly has taken place. And I think the world has to press
Deputy Bacik.
to be allowed into Gaza to see what is going on.
Bacik.
Well, Taoiseach, I've acknowledged Ireland's leadership at EU level on Gaza. I think that's very welcome. But we can and should do more. You've used strong words, and I welcome those words. You've acknowledged that what Israel is carrying out is a war crime. And of course, like you, I've condemned Hamas outright. Of course I've called for release of all hostages. Of course. But what Israel is doing now with impunity, while we see 14,000 infants on the brink of death through starvation, this has to stop, Taoiseach. Ireland has to do more at international level and here at home to use every lever in our power to stop what Israel is doing. So, Taoiseach, if you fear that the Occupied Territories Bill will be struck down, let's test that. Let's take that risk. Because across the opposition, there is support for the Occupied Territories Bill. We've all been pushing for it to be passed. And you told me yesterday there would be progress on it. If you fear that the General Assembly will vote the wrong way, let's find out. Let's take that bold and brave step at United Nations level, Taoiseach. I'm calling on you to do that, and our motion next week will call on all parties in this House to support that call.
But to be fair, Deputy, I mean, it's more than just words from Ireland. We have contributed significantly funding to Palestine, to the Palestinian Authority, to UNRWA, which has been much maligned, but is the only UN agency that has the capacity to not only facilitate the surge of humanitarian into Gaza, but also to facilitate the reconstruction of Gaza in terms of capacity terms. And most people will admit that privately, and if they're not prepared to admit it publicly. I'm talking about international opinion. As you know, in terms of the UN, Ireland has been very active with other countries. We recognise the state of Palestine with Norway and Spain back in May of last year. We also, in July of 2024, the International Court of Justice delivered an advisory opinion on that, and the Attorney General, on behalf of the government, made a submission, an oral submission to the court in respect of this. We then co-sponsored a resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly on the 18th of September, which seeks to implement the court's advisory opinion.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
We also intervened in the South African International Court of Justice
Thank
case
you.
against Israel under the Genocide Convention.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
And now I think we will work very hard in respect of the EU-Israel Association
Thank
Agreement,
you,
where there's
Taoiseach.
been a
Deputy
significant
Cian
shift in
O'Callaghan,
opinion in
Social
the European Union,
Democrats.
which is important.
Deputy O'Callaghan.
Gur Mágat. Taoiseach, Cara Darmody is continuing her protest outside the Dáil today because nothing she has heard from this government has convinced her to end it. Asked repeatedly yesterday if your government would stop breaking the law, you couldn't even give that assurance. Taoiseach, you don't seem to see the problem with this. You have access to state resources, you can direct policy, and you can authorise hiring. You can fix this. Yet despite having all these tools and resources at your disposal, all you could offer yesterday was the same old tired excuses. Taoiseach, I want to examine some of those excuses now. You said yesterday that fundamentally we need to change the legislation when it comes to assessment of need. When exactly did you arrive at this decision? Because the High Court struck down the accelerated assessment procedure more than 3 years ago. You've had all of that time to act, but you didn't. Taoiseach, the procedure was struck down for a good reason. It consisted of 1 hour of observed playtime and a 30-minute discussion with a parent. Children were then diagnosed as having a disability, but not told which disability they had. It was a completely inadequate box-ticking exercise. Are you telling us that this is the system that you are going to return to, or is your plan to get rid of assessment of need altogether? Taoiseach, you also said yesterday you were in the process of setting up a disability unit in your department. It is now nearly 6 months since the election. How far along in this process are you? What is the delay in setting it up? If the issue is really a priority, why wasn't it done on day one? The reality is successive governments have claimed disability is a priority. Endless waiting lists for assessment of need and vital services tell a very different story. Parents know that early intervention can make the world of difference to their child, between learning how to speak or getting left behind. Can you imagine what it's like to see your child placed on an endless waiting list as they miss key milestones? Taoiseach, as Cara has learned, when it comes to this government, talk is cheap. Last year, when Cara met your colleague, Simon Harris, he made commitments to her. Instead of keeping those promises, they were broken. Cara has said that it doesn't matter what age you are, anyone who makes a promise should keep it. If they don't, their credibility will be gone. Taoiseach, the credibility of this government is already in tatters with a list of broken promises. But there is an opportunity now for you to rebuild it. Taoiseach, following your meeting with Cara this morning, can you now tell us when are you going to stop breaking the law?
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Deputy, first of all, I would disagree fundamentally with your sentiments when you say we don't see the problem. Of course we see the problem. And we've made that very clear that we see the issue here in terms of assessment of need. And I'm not making any excuses. I'm just focused on solutions. And I've heard precious little from anybody here on the opposition side in terms of solution-driven approach. Very little. I've had a lot of rhetoric, but heard little on the solution front. And if I could equally say, you referenced the High Court decision, I've no intention of going back to the standing operating procedures. But I do believe when a High Court makes a decision, its clinicians should ultimately decide in terms of the nature and type of provision on therapy or medicine or anything, ultimately. So there should have been, but the last government didn't follow through for different reasons. There wasn't agreement in respect of it after on the High Court decision. This government is adamant we're going to deal with that aspect. It's only one aspect of it, one strand, and it does need to be looked at because there needs to be a framework that allows therapists to intervene faster and more quickly in terms of providing services to children. And an assessment of need, by the way, is not a static thing, nor should it be. As a child develops, the child needs ongoing review. And that is why the government has already taken a decision to have a national in-school therapy service, something I campaigned for during the election and said it would be about a red line for me in terms of the programme for government, and our partners in government, the Fine Gael Party and the Independents, are fully aligned to that objective. And the Minister for Education, Anna McEntee, has initiated that process for a national in-school therapy service, starting in the special schools, which is absolutely essential. We are increasing the level of assessments, but we need more than the 20% increase that happened last year. We need to recruit more therapists. We're going to do that also. We need to engage with CORU in terms of faster recognition of qualifications for those who come in from overseas to work in our services as therapists. Far more flexibility is required there to supplement and add to the therapists that will come through our colleges. And we will increase the places in third level colleges also, but all of that takes some time, and we will be procuring additional capacity from the private sector. But there is a fundamental point in terms of ensuring that there's early intervention with children by therapists. And then there is a problem that arises if every therapist is going to spend 90 hours assessing children, then there'll be precious little resource for actually intervention. And we need to get that balance right, Deputy. And that is something the government is focusing on, and that's something that we need to work on in respect of both the legislative provision, and we've asked for ideas and proposals around that. And the Health Service Executive have been saying have been highlighting the court decision for quite some time.
Deputy O'Callaghan.
And that's to answer your question on that.
Taoiseach, that is an astonishing answer. The High Court judgment was more than 3 years ago, and you've just now told us that the reason there hasn't been acted on, you haven't got your act together in this, is because the previous government couldn't agree on what to do. Is that the case? That we've more than 15,000 children waiting for an assessment of need that they desperately need beyond the 6-month limit, that you're breaking the law because for the past 3 years you and your government colleagues haven't been able to get your act together and agree on what to do? Is that the case? What we need now from you is detail on how you're going to fix this, because you've been talking around changing the law, hiring more people, but when are you actually going to stop breaking the law? And it's not acceptable if you and your government colleagues have been breaking the law for more than 3 years simply because of letting down children and their families who desperately need access to services and assessment of need, simply because you couldn't agree amongst yourselves what to do.
Thank you, Deputy.
Again, Deputy, you're not correct in that at all. In terms of one specific, you asked specifically about the law, and I gave you a straight answer to it, and that this government is going to deal with that aspect of it. But the outgoing government dealt with a whole lot of other issues pertaining to this. So, for example, in terms of about 4,162 assessments completed in 2024, that's a 30% increase in 2023. And that upward trend is continuing in terms of the assessments that have been completed in the first 3 months of this year. A 65% increase compared to the same period last year, in the first quarter of this year. So it's not as if nothing has been done or it's been ignored. That's just a deliberate distortion by your good self. But you also need to look at the reality as well and say, what are you saying we should do in terms of the balance between assessment and direct intervention with the therapists that we have? Be the therapists in the private sector and the public sector. There's a finite capacity. Maybe we can get more out of that entirety of that capacity of therapists in the country, be it private or public.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
But you need to come clean as well. And not just take the comfortable position of saying that whatever we produce on this side of the house, you'll simply condemn and have a go at it.
Deputy Richard O'Donoghue of the Independent Technical Group.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, every day that we come in here, we're hearing housing, 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 housing. So during the week, the EPA done a report. The EPA done a report on the local authorities on inspections of septic tanks. And they targeted them where they were near rivers, and they done 1,390 reports, the county council done, on the tanks. And they found that 82% of these tanks were inadequate. But we're talking about meeting housing targets here. What the EPA hasn't done has looked at the treatment systems that we've been looking for upgrading for the last number of years, decades actually, for the upgrade of treatment systems that are actually going straight into the rivers. Now, I'm in construction all my life, and I'm still in construction. We've given ideas to the likes of Ishgairden how they could actually have more sewerage capacity in towns and villages on the same systems that they have already if they separated the storm water from the sewerage. But all towns and villages and cities, when they're piped from the houses out to the main street, they're all gone into one pipe. We gave them an idea of putting in separators for water. At the moment, our treatment systems are actually working at their best during the summer because they're not dealing with water and they're way below capacity. So actually 25 to 30% of our sewerage systems are working perfectly during the summer. During the winter, we are now treating 70-odd% water. And what happens is when the sewerage comes with the water and it comes to a level in the treatment system, nothing gets treated because it goes out over the baffle wall and straight into the waterways around Ireland. That's all your rivers, streams and heads all around the country, straight, untreated, because we don't have the proper people dealing with it. Ishgairden, to me, are a runaway train. They're not value for money, they're not listening to anyone, and there is solutions there for our systems in this country to give us clean water by putting in different systems to deal with the equipment that we have at the moment, and then we can upgrade as we can afford to upgrade. But they're not listening to common sense. They're not listening to other engineers, the technology is there to do what we have to do. And it's very simple what we have to do. But they're coming and telling you this system is broken, this system is broken, this system is broken. They're not listening to an engineering solution to help build more houses with the same systems that we have at the moment, by just separating the water from the sewerage.
Thank you, Deputy.
That's what I'm asking.
Taoiseach.
First of all, I thank the Deputy in respect of what is a very key issue. And again, you began in terms of septic tanks, largely in terms of existing housing stock across the length and breadth of the country. And it is important that we improve upon that and enhance their capacity, or refurbish or develop, provide grant assistance to enable people to replace septic tanks that are old and not performing to the optimal level. And I mean, there are a lot of engineers in Ishgairden, and a lot of them would argue they know what they're doing. And I have met them, and I think we discussed, for example, one of the critical issues in towns and villages across the country is perhaps to free up capacity to local builders, for example, if they're developing a housing estate or 20 houses or 50 houses, that they would be able to develop their own treatment facility according to the spec that would be set by Ishgairden, for example, and that would then be subject to inspection. And I think that would help to create additional house building in towns and villages across the country, where currently, because of absence of capacity or no further capacity, such projects cannot get off the ground, and a memorandum of understanding has been designed now, developed between local authorities and between the Ishgairden in respect of that issue to set out the proposals around that to enable that to happen. And in terms of the issue of the separation stormwater from sewage, I mean, again, won't profess to say I'm technically as competent as your good self in this area, but likewise I would say that you mentioned the EPA. All of the work of the Ishgairden is subject to compliance with the EPA, and it is one of the regulatory authorities that govern Ishgairden, along with the CRU and others as well. But they have made a lot of progress. Of that there is no doubt. I mean, there's been a dramatic increase in water quality across the better country over the last decade or so. Now, local authorities did a lot of that work initially prior to the establishment of Irish Water, and I do think we need to maintain and retain a degree of local competency and local knowledge in our local authorities on water, sewage and so forth. And there needs to be good partnerships between local authorities and Irish Water in that respect. I was just in Arklow recently, and a first-class, state-of-the-art wastewater treatment plant provided by Irish Water 6 months ahead of schedule and on budget. And so a lot of progress is happening. I will relay what you were saying to Irish Water. I don't know whether you've engaged with them as a Dáil deputy or with others.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
I note the most favourite word among independent groupings in this House is common sense.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
It
Deputy O'Donoghue.
suggests that maybe you guys have a monopoly of it over everybody else. But I'll say no more than that.
Well, Taoiseach, the first part that you said you've met with Irish Water, maybe you need to bring me with you to teach them a bit of common sense and give them a bit of ideas, solutions. We mentioned there at the start the EPA and the septic tanks. Yes, we have. But the problem with the grant system for the septic tanks, in 2013 you brought in a system where you got 5,000. In 2013 there was a system there that you got €5,000 to upgrade your tank. You registered your tank. If you got qualified for that your tank was defunct, you got the grant. But the problem was nobody qualified for the grant because you had to be tested first. Little amount of people are tested. Now that's up to 12,000. But there's a mapping system now that actually 3/4 of people in this country don't qualify for that either. So you've grants available for defunct tanks, but they can't get the grants. Look at the mapping system that's been introduced by the EPA. I'm asking about equal opportunity for towns and villages, and I'm offering to help the government. I'm not going to criticise, I'm offering to help you. We have tanks in Ula 15 years, Skeeton 46 years waiting to be upgraded for treatment systems.
Taoiseach,
This is what I'm talking about. I'm offering you your help. I'll meet you with Ishkare and we'll go and ask them how we can improve the system.
What are you saying about Skeeton?
46 years waiting for a solar system.
And that's why I think we have to, like with the best will in the world, if we want to get to 50,000 houses a year, spoken to Ishkare about this, they have a national mapping exercise already. They will have to, and if we give an extra couple of billion to Ishkare over the coming years, they will have to concentrate that spend on the big cities and the big areas of population. So therefore, for smaller villages and towns, we need an alternative system which allows for the provision of sewage treatment plants by the builder, but in accordance with detailed specifications from Irish Water, which is agreed now, right? And that will happen, is my understanding, and that would then, I think, help the Askeetons of this world, the Clough-Jordans of this world, and others who've been waiting for quite some time. But if you're to look at the enormity of the investment required for every village in the country, cannot be done centrally alone by Irish Water. Capacity just doesn't exist to do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Taoiseach. And that
I accept your
concludes
good wishes
leaders'
on that.
questions. We now move under order, standing order.